Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I want to welcome you to this Dickey Center Great Issues lecture. It is hard to think of anything more fundamental, more elemental than water. Most of us, as we all learned in elementary school, are about 60% water on any given day, and there's nothing we need more frequently or more urgently outside of air than water to keep us going. Perhaps more seriously, there's probably no better indicator of one's likelihood to survive infancy and childhood than access to clean water, and indeed one's lifelong prospects are determined by that. In international affairs, the issue of water rights is now a matter of vital national interest for many countries around the world. And that's why I'm so pleased that we're having this lecture on the global water crisis and the coming battle for the right to water, and that our speaker today is Maude Barlow. Maude Barlow has been a citizen activist in the very best sense of the word for 4 decades. She is the founder and national chairperson of the Council of Canadians, Canada's largest public advocacy organization, which has more than 50,000 members. She was a founding member of the council in 1985 and has served as its voluntary chair since 1988. And during these years, the Council of Canadians has been a leading voice in Canada and around the world for social, environmental, and economic justice. The Council fights to protect Canada's public social programs, natural resources heritage, and its food security. As a renowned leader of the global water justice movement, Maude is currently chairperson of the board of Food and Water Watch, based in the U.S., and it is the foremost American organization for fighting for the right to water. She is the co-author of a book that was published in 2002, Blue Gold, The Fight to Stop Corporate Theft of the World's Water, which is now published in over 40 countries and 15 languages. Her newest book, Blue Covenant, The Global Water Crisis and the Coming Battle for the Right to Water, was published in 2007 and was an international bestseller. I believe she's published about 16 books, is that correct? Countless articles and reports. And for those of us who have internet age attention spans, many blogs on the Huffington Post Canadian site, which I heartily recommend. She has a list of awards, honorary degrees longer than my arm, and she was recently named the first advisor on water to the President of the General Assembly at the United Nations. It is a great pleasure to welcome Maude Barlow to Dartmouth.
Well, thank you very, very much, Director Benjamin. And the first things first, can you hear me? Everybody good? All right. Well, I thank you very much for your beautiful introduction, and thank you to Jessica and the Dickey Center for this opportunity to be here today. I'm going to talk at you for a little bit and then like to open this up for discussion. I live in Ottawa, Canada. Drove down yesterday. It was a lovely drive. The easiest way to get here, believe me. Avoiding planes is my happy thing. And I do a lot of work both in my country and in your country and around the world on the whole issue of the human right to water, trying to pull together the different strands of environment science over here, which is not how I came at it originally. I originally came at it from the human rights side, but my belief that we have to pull them together. So the environment and science here and the issues around development rights and so on over here and how they come together. And so I've been deeply involved in the creation of a global water justice movement. We call ourselves water warriors sometimes. And we're out to save the world's water and to make sure that it's more justly and equitably shared among all of us, especially as we are a planet moving to something like 9 or 10 billion people in the coming decades. What we do with this declining resource is really important, and the decisions we make now are really important. So I'm just going to start off with the major concerns, and I won't stay negative, but I do think we have to just kind of face some facts about what we're dealing with here. Way back in, I don't know, grade 6 or whatever, we all learned that there's a hydrologic cycle and a certain amount of water in the hydrologic cycle, and it goes around and we can't destroy it. And that's true. It's still here somewhere on the planet. But what was wrong with that lesson is that what a colleague of mine calls modern water, the way we have treated water in modern times or with modern technology or with our, I would argue to an extent, our Western technological bias. We've removed water from its ecological, its cultural, its historical, its spiritual reality, and we've moved it to become a kind of resource for our greater pleasure, our profit, our convenience, and to build a certain kind of economy. It's water, the way we've used water has driven the Industrial Revolution, has driven the global economy, and we've taken water from where nature has put it, and we've used it to build reservoirs and dams. We've dammed most of the mighty rivers in the world. Most of them don't reach the ocean anymore. We're now pumping groundwater using technology we didn't have 50 years ago. And I want to think about these bore wells. They go as deep into the ground as Chicago skyscrapers go into the air, and they pump this water absolutely relentlessly. In fact, a new study on groundwater takings that was done internationally coordinated through the UN says that we're actually doubling the use of, and mining, they call it groundwater mining, every 20 years. So we're using groundwater far faster than it can be replenished by nature. And what that means is that some parts of the world are actually physically running out. We're not just talking about drought. We'll hear about drought, we read about drought, but it's actually, in some parts of the world, the end of water. We're also displacing water for irrigation. You take a look at a lake that was called the Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union. It was pumped mercilessly for cotton production in the desert. This is a story being told around the world where we take water sources and we use them in inappropriate ways. Big agribusiness, big agriculture, growing the wrong thing in the wrong place is a very big part of this story. Assuming that dry, arid regions shouldn't be dry and arid, and pumping water to them is another thing that we do. We also take massive amounts of land-based water and we flow it through big thirsty cities. And you know, as you know, these cities can be 10, 20, 30 million people, and if they're anywhere near the ocean, that water is dumped into the ocean. And this study, if you want to know the reference, it's a man named Mark Birkins. You can get all this from our website, but he says that at least a quarter of the cause of rising oceans is in fact the dumping of land-based water into the ocean. It's not climate change as we've understood it, but it's in fact the way we treat water, the way we displace it and mishandle it and so on is actually part of the climate story. It's not just that water is a victim of climate change. The way we treat water is one of the causes of climate change. And then we have the trade in virtual water. And virtual water is a really important concept we need to understand better. Virtual water is the water that's embedded in everything that we have, from the table here to the glasses to my pen to computer chips. Takes an enormous amount of water to build computers, to food production, most particularly commodities. So when we traditionally look at water use, we think about what individuals or families use in their homes in terms of showers and food production and so on, but that's a minuscule part of our water footprint. It's about a quarter of our individual water footprint. Our far bigger one is this virtual water. And the more we have globalization, the more water is actually physically removed from a watershed to go into a product that's then exported out. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day. And if you're anywhere in England or Europe tomorrow and you receive Valentine roses, 90% likely they've come up from the lake in Kenya called Lake Naivasha, where the film Out of Africa was filmed. To save their own water footprint, because Europe is one of the areas that's very worried about water, and Great Britain as well, they very often have their roses growing elsewhere. So Lake Naivasha and the beautiful Rift Valley in Kenya produces most of the roses for Europe. So they use their water and they're destroying that lake very, very quickly, so that Great Britain can actually import what's called its footprint. They import 2/3 of their footprint. That's all the water that you need for your goods and services. And so if you're not using your own water, then you're importing your water from somewhere else. And one of the big global issues that we have to start looking at is where is this water moving and how is it moving? So we know that, and this is another study, and I won't keep throwing studies at you, but we know from another huge study that was done recently, actually by the big bottled water companies and the big food companies that are very worried about running out of water. And they say that by 2030, the demand for water in our world will outstrip supply by 40%, which is a stunning statistic if you stop and think about it and think about the suffering that we're going to see as this continues to grow as a crisis in our world. So consequently, we are a planet looking at running out of water in certain parts of the world. Northern China, there are 4,000 cities now in danger of being overtaken by the desert. Beijing, they're saying they may have to move the capital from Beijing. We're talking about India, most of Pakistan, 22 countries in Africa, although they've just found a big new aquifer in Africa. So there's going to be a big struggle about who gets that water, and that's going to be an interesting one to watch. Australia's in trouble. Australia has the big one water source, the Murray-Darling River. Until the flood last year, it had stopped reaching the mouth of the ocean. The mouth of the river stopped reaching the ocean because they've built a huge agribusiness up around the Murray-Darling with corn and rice and cotton and wine, all the uses of this water. So it gets sucked up and then they ship it all over the world. Australia is the leading virtual water exporter in the world. The United States and Canada and Brazil. Those are the four top exporters in the world. And that's a country that doesn't have the water to spare. So consequently, these are countries, parts of the world, the Mediterranean, the Middle East. Mexico City is sinking on itself because all the water underneath is gone. Large parts of Latin America even are now in crisis. I was down in Brazil not long ago on a conference around the Guarani Aquifer, which is now considered to be the biggest aquifer in the world, saying to them, if you don't take care of it and if you don't name it as a public trust and start setting really tough rules about who gets it and who has access to it, you're going to lose it. So we are a world literally running out of accessible fresh water. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that we're beginning to see some struggles around who gets access to water and some conflicts. One of those conflicts involves water grabs, land and water grabs, where wealthy countries or wealthy investors go into some countries and buy up land and water. There's now land twice the size of Great Britain in in Africa alone, that's been bought up by foreign interests. And many of us believe this is a new form of colonialism where this land and this water and the best water is taken to grow food to send back to these, the parent company or the country that put the money into it. Then we have disputes between the needs of megacities, and they're increasingly demanding around water, and the communities, the rural communities, the peasant communities, the indigenous communities from which water is being taken. We are having conflicts there. I actually visited a fortress outside of Mexico City, about 60 miles outside of Mexico City, where the state had actually just put a pipe into an indigenous water source, put a great big fortress around it with armed guards, and just confiscated the water because they said we need it in Mexico, and there's been a great deal of conflict around that, including some of the local people taking axes and trying to break the pipes and so on. We get the human rights crisis, and that's the reality that in our world running out of water, we also have deep and abiding inequities. And so we have countries around the world where some people have all the water they can ever use because they can afford it, and millions are going without. It is the greatest threat. It is the greatest killer of young children, the lack of access to clean water. In the global south, every 3.5 seconds a child dies of waterborne disease. In every single case of those children's parents have been able to afford clean water, those kids would not be dead. So it's very much not just an issue of lack of water, but it's an issue of profound injustice as well. So I call this the perfect storm, or maybe we should call it the perfect drought, and that's the creation of a more inequitable world between rich and poor, rising water rates around the world, declining water stocks, and a demand that's growing. I mean, if you look at the charts, the demand is going straight up and the supply is going straight down. And I should point out that it's not just in the global south that we're seeing this human rights crisis. Close to 90,000 people in inner city Detroit have had their water cut off because they can't afford the water rates, and people have to walk often miles to go find water sources and drag water home, just as you would in a global south community. And with the new austerity measures in Europe now, they've jacked the price of water and electricity up. They're also privatizing the water. And the people are having their water cut off. They're being evicted from their homes if they can't pay their water and electricity rates. And, I mean, when you have youth unemployment in Spain and Greece and Portugal of 60%, you know that you have a crisis. So what's happening is that a lot of public services are being sold off. So it's not just in the global south that this is happening. So that leads me to the conflict I've been most involved in, and that is the question around whether water is a commodity to be put on the open market for sale, because that's where a lot of people would take this now. That's the answer that a lot of people have. Or is water a public trust, human right, and what I would consider to be part of our common heritage? And the ways that we're privatizing water in the world are many. The major ones are privatization of utilities or services. And this happens when the World Bank and the other development banks say to a poor country, well, if you want funding for water services, we're going to fund you, but you have to take one of the big water companies, usually Veolia or Suez. One of the first big water wars in the world was in Cochabamba, Bolivia, back a decade ago, when Bechtel was brought in by the World Bank to run the water there. And not only did they triple the price of water, and this is a very poor country and people couldn't afford it, but they actually said, we own the rain that comes from the sky, and any water that you capture on cisterns and so on is ours, and you have to pay us for it. So the people took to the streets. Literally, there was a war. They brought the army in. People were killed. The people won. Bechtel was forced to leave, and then Bechtel sued the government of Bolivia under one of these investor-state bilateral agreements, you know, where a corporation can sue the government of another country. And although they won, they settled for $1 because they knew that public opinion was so against them around the world, because we created a big to-do about it. But this is a very big issue now in Europe, where, as I say, the austerity measures are promoting privatization. And in Italy, last year they had a referendum and they had an overwhelming vote against privatization. So for now, they've put it on hold. But now there's a European-wide referendum being held very soon against water privatization. So it's a really life and death struggle that's taking place there. Then there's bottled water. In bottled water, we put about 250 billion liters of water in little plastic bottles last year. That's gallons, it's about a quarter of that. We switched to metric in Canada, so I'm now trying to remember, but it's about a quarter of that. It's a $100 billion industry, and if you were to take all of the individual water bottles that people use, just the water, not the other bottles, in the world last year and put them end to end, they would reach to the moon and back 65 times. So we're creating an enormous amount of garbage with an industry that, certainly in North America and in Europe at least, where you can get clean water out of the tap, is not necessary. But the bottled water industry is exploding, because what they want to do, and I've got a great quote in my new book from one of the bottled water CEOs, who says, we want to do with bottled water what the phone companies did with cell phones. They flooded the global south with cell phones, so it wasn't necessary to put landlines in anymore. And that's what they want to do with bottled water. We'll just flood the global south, and then you won't have to put in proper water systems, meaning there won't be public water. So it'll still be very private, and if you can afford it, you can afford it, and if not, well, I guess that's too bad. And then you get something called water trading, and water trading is where you have a water license that's been converted to a right, and so you start trading it. Chile has gone 100% privatized as an example of kind of the extreme. Chile has privatized all of their utilities, and now they've privatized all of their water rights, and they actually have public auctions. And Canadian mining companies, and I have to tell you, I am so embarrassed about our mining industry. I apologize to anybody who knows how horrible they are. They are the worst in the world. I mean, that the industry itself had a report that got leaked last year to a Canadian journalist, and it said that the Canadian mining companies have by far the worst reputation in terms of environment and human rights and so on. But in any case, these companies come into communities and are being told to, given all sorts of trading rights. And in Chile, the Canadian mining companies are actually going in and bidding for actual water. We're not just talking about the concept of water rights, but the actual water against local communities, against local indigenous peoples, and physically able to say, well, we own that water, so we can put whatever we want into it. That's our water, and we can poison it if we want. Another way water's being privatized is through trade agreements. I don't know if you noticed that when the president gave his speech last night, he talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a new trade agreement, the U.S. European Union trade agreement. And that will include investor state rights like we have in NAFTA, where corporations will be able to sue governments, other governments. And we have a situation, we already have a precedent in Canada where an American company, Abitibi-Bowater, was operating in Newfoundland, our province, the Rock in the Atlantic, and left on their own 4 years ago. They went bankrupt, and they just picked up and left jobs and left pensions unpaid and so on. Then they turned around and they said, but we want to be paid for the water we left behind. And the government there said, what do you mean? You left behind jobs? That's our water. You got to use it when you were creating jobs here. And they said no, and under NAFTA Chapter 11, they sued, and the Canadian government gave them $130 million. So we have set a precedent where a corporation can actually claim to own the water rights in another country. So these are all the ways in which we're feeling a kind of what I call an enclosure of the commons. And the commons being an ancient concept we're trying to revive, and this notion that there are certain things that should be understood to be our common heritage, and I would argue that no one has the right to appropriate something for profit when other people are dying from lack of access to it. And I'll just give you a flavor of what we're talking about. This guy is his name is William Buter, his chief economist with Citibank. And he's talking about a near future with a massive expansion of investment in the water section. And he says, I see fleets of water tankers and storage facilities that will dwarf those that we have for oil and natural gas. I expect to see globally integrated markets for fresh water within 20 to 30 years. There will be different grades and types of fresh water, just the way we have light, sweet, and heavy sour crude oil today. And then he says, water as an asset class will, in my view, become eventually the single most important physical commodity-based asset class, dwarfing oil, copper, agriculture, commodities, and precious metals. So this is a kind of an extension of this privatization, and people call it the financialization of nature, or the financialization of water. And it's the next stage of this struggle that we're having to keep control of water. I just talk a little bit about the U.S., and then I want to talk about some of what I think we can and should and are doing about this. Just to say that the U.S. is one of the areas of the world that is potentially under great threat from water shortage. There are 36 states in the United States that are either currently or in the near future to be threatened with serious water shortages, and some of them are quite acute. The Southwest, of course, are in the worst trouble, although Florida and the Southeast are as well. The Colorado only has half the flow it had several decades ago. One scientist said that it's in, I quote, catastrophic decline. The Ogallala Aquifer is the underground lake of absolutely pristine water that goes from the eastern slope of the Rockies to the Texas Panhandle. And it does not replenish, it's not naturally replenished, and there are over 200,000 bore wells around the Ogallala Aquifer pumping 24/7. This is the aquifer that had Obama say no to the first phase of the Keystone Pipeline because people didn't want it going over the Ogallala. So now they've slightly rerouted it, but it's got other big problems. But anyway, this is the famous Ogallala. David Brower is the head of the U.S. Agriculture Department's Ogallala Research Service, and he says that we've already drained enough water from the Ogallala with overpumping for agricultural production to fill half of Lake Erie. He says we've gone from 240 feet down to 80 feet. And he says, and I quote, and I thought this should have been on the front page of every newspaper in this country, and it wasn't, Ogallala supply will run out, and the plains will become uneconomical to farm in our lifetime. That is beyond reasonable argument. Our goal now is to engineer a soft landing. Now you've got to understand what we're saying here. We're talking about the water system in the United States that produces the majority of food for the United States, including a massive amount of food for export, will run out in our lifetime, says the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Not if and or when, it will happen. And I find it a stunning statement, and I find it in my country too. Believe me, I'm no fan of my own government, but I find it astounding that there was yet another presidential election in this country with no discussion of the water crisis here. It is, in my opinion, more urgent or more immediate, or certainly more catastrophic immediately than the climate crisis, or put it another way, it's the first phase of the climate crisis. And you should know, talked about virtual water, you should know that that a third of the water that Americans use every day that's appropriated for your use actually doesn't just leave the watershed in the form of these exports, it leaves the country. And most of those exports come from the very states that don't have enough water and certainly don't have enough rainwater. They're having to use irrigation. So somebody tough in this country is going to have to come along and say what we're doing, how we're subsidizing farmers to use water they don't need in some cases, and not having water for others. The whole notion of first in time, first in right in the western states has created problems. Somebody brave is going to come along and start this dialogue in this country, but my hope is that it's going to happen before you start turning on your taps and water doesn't come out. I was in a middle-class apartment in Mexico City not long ago, and no water. There's just no water, and it happens just regularly. It's not an impossible thing to think about, even in our countries. And the Great Lakes, we've got a big project on the Great Lakes because we're really worried about the Great Lakes. Between climate change and multi-point pollution and over-extraction, the Great Lakes are in trouble. And in fact, the study I told you about, the Birkin study on groundwater takings, they said that if the Great Lakes are being pumped as fast as water globally, the Great Lakes could be bone dry. Their words, bone dry in 80 years. Again, I thought, now that'll make the front page of all the papers. Don't you think that's a story? I mean, I think it's kind of a story. Anybody who's got a property near the Great Lakes, or the majority of the, not Lake Superior, but the others, will tell you this is where the dock is and that's where the water is. You can see it if you're living on it. And the new threats to the Great Lakes are pipelines from the Alberta tar sands, taking the dirtiest oil on earth, bitumen, the stuff that would go in the Keystone Pipeline if that's allowed. And it's being moved to refineries all along the northern part of the Great Lakes. So there are new threats and fracking threats coming as well. So, okay, what do we do about all this? Well, as you can see, I'm very worried about it, and so I spend a lot of my time reading and writing and organizing and getting people together to fight for not just the knowledge of what's happening, but to fight for certain fundamental principles, because I believe that we need to build policy and practice based on certain principles, and if we don't get the principles right, it's just going to be a mishmash of stuff all over the place. So I deeply believe that we need to base a water-secure future on a set of principles, and I'll offer the major three, although all of them kind of have subsets, but the major three. First of all, I would say that we have to declare that our water everywhere is a part of our common heritage, and it's a public trust. And this notion of commons, as I say, is very ancient. We talk about the modern enclosure of the commons in Great Britain when the peasants were allowed to use the lands, graze the lands, and so on. fish and hunt and so on, even if it was owned by nobility, but it was understood that they needed this for life. And then the enclosure was when laws were brought in to remove these rights, and literally people's lives were put at stake. Well, I see a modern enclosure of our water commons, and when you look at certain parts of the world, you can see that the decisions around who's going to get water is imminent, and it's not going to be the majority. It's not going to be for ecosystems. It's not going to be for the human right to water. It's going to be for the powerful interests that have gotten a hold of this water. So I would argue that we need to pass laws. I would argue that we have to fiercely manage this water commons. This is not a free-for-all. There isn't a human right to, a swimming pool. We're talking about fiercely managing and gauging. So what we need to do with a watershed is say, what do we have here? How long, what are the demands on the water now? What will they be in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years? And we have to set priorities for who's going to have access to that water. Yes, there is a commercial use for water, but I argue very, very strongly that we cannot allow the private sector to decide who gets access to water and who does not, because you can never have the profit motive involved in decisions around who gets access. So we have to keep water as a public service, I would argue, protect public tap water. We have to say no to water trading, and now there's the beginning of a new type of trading, and that's water pollution trading. And there's a new project around Chesapeake Bay that I consider the slippery slope of a beginning of allowing some companies to pollute while buying their way out. And if you want more information on that, go to the website of Food and Water Watch here in the US, foodandwaterwatch.org. And we have to extend public trust laws. There is a very rich history of public trust in the United States. There's actually quite strong public trust laws around the Great Lakes, but not usually for groundwater. So a few years ago, Vermont, that had no protection whatsoever for its groundwater, was finding that companies were coming in and putting bore wells down, just helping themselves to the water. So they brought in a law that said that their water is a public trust, both their surface and groundwater. And they're very clear about that. They say what that means is that in times of shortage, they can actually give preference to water for regular daily use, water for ecosystem protection, and water for food for local consumption as opposed to food for export. And that's a very different system than the kind of California, Texas model. In fact, T. Boone Pickens, the energy gazillionaire, well, he's buying up huge amounts of the Ogallala aquifer and selling it for profit. And in my world, that shouldn't be allowed. Nobody, because they have money, should be able to buy up water that people desperately need. The people in Detroit desperately need. So that's principle number one. Principle number two is that water has rights as well, and that we've got to stop thinking of water as this resource to serve our lifestyle, our world. Most of nature, and particularly water, is written into our laws as property, and it's very difficult to define any kind of separate law or any kind of separate protection for water. So we haven't seen it as the essential element of a living ecosystem that gives us life. We've seen it as this abstraction, this resource, this water out there that's flowing around that we can tap into. And so we pave over it, and we dump stuff into it, and we move it, and we pipe it, and we dam it, and we treat water in ways that we now know are just terribly damaging. So we need to make our human laws more compatible with the laws of nature. And I would argue that the protection of water has to be at the basis of all of our policy, public policy, from energy policy, so that when we're looking at biofuels or we're looking at fracking, we say, okay, maybe natural gas is better than coal or nuclear or whatever, but if you're destroying the water table at the same time, you've set up air against water, and this isn't right. I would argue that on trade agreements, we need to be saying what's the impact on trade. Urban design, we still build these new modern developments that just pave over water systems, wetlands, and so on. In my vision, in my world, that wouldn't be acceptable. It wouldn't be, in fact, it would be against the law. And I quote Martin Luther King, who used to say, legislation may not change the heart, but it will restrain the heartless. We absolutely need good law, and we don't have good law protecting our water. And the whole notion of economic growth, unlimited growth, I believe is at the heart of the problem here, and we have to start a process of what a colleague of mine calls deglobalization, which isn't to say we're not going to trade, but it is to say that we start asking what can be grown or produced closer to home, and we start protecting our watersheds in that way, and most particularly around agriculture. The major consumer of water, and that's water that gets consumed and not returned to the watershed, is industrial agriculture. And we have got to look at our global food systems. Keeping food local, keeping it organic, keeping it sustainable is one of the most important things we can do. And we are, a number of us, working toward a notion of having rights of nature, or having a declaration at the United Nations on the rights of nature. After the COP, the climate summit in Copenhagen 3 years ago, Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, invited the global climate justice movement to come to Cochabamba, Bolivia, and have a different kind of meeting, because the one in Copenhagen was horrible, really horrible in every way. First of all, you got off the plane and you were greeted by little, what I call Coca-Cola elves, and they were people dressed in little red outfits and gave you glasses of Coca-Cola, and it was like the UN Summit on Climate brought to you by Coca-Cola. And everywhere you went, there were billboards with happy children running through clean meadows, and there was lovely water, and it was all Coca-Cola. So they started, their marketing was that it was Copenhagen was Hopenhagen. I started calling it Copenhagen. It was just like such a, it was awful actually. And the police were brutal to the youth. Anybody who was sort of under 30 was just targeted. It was really quite a confrontation and a failure. When I got back on the plane to leave, I'm afraid I said the F word to one of the little elves, and I felt badly afterwards. But it was just like, you're harassing me. The entire time I've been in Copenhagen, I've been followed by Coca-Cola, leave me alone sort of thing. So what we did when we met in Cochabamba was we came up with the Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, and it's gorgeous, and it's on our website if you want to look at it. And we had the honor of presenting it to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, who loved it, actually. I can say that because he said so. And we would like one day for it to be a standalone with the UN Declaration of Human Rights as a manifesto that shifts the way we think about nature. And I'll just quote to you from a lovely man whose name is Cormac Cullinan. He's an environmental and human rights lawyer in Cape Town, South Africa, and he's written a wonderful book called Wild Law, if you want to learn more about this. And he says, the day will come when the failure of our laws to recognize the right of a river to flow, to prohibit acts that destabilize the Earth's climate, or to impose a duty to respect the intrinsic value and right to exist of all life will be as reprehensible as allowing people to be bought and sold. He says future generations will look back on our generation and see that the way we treated nature is basically a form of slavery, and that even just for self-protection we have to end that notion that nature is here to serve us. And my third and final principle, and then I want to open this up to chat with you, is that we need to ensure adequate water for all, the human right to water and sanitation. And you might say to me, that is just such a motherhood. How could anybody be against it? Well, let me tell you, the fight for the right to water at the UN was fierce and ugly. Opposed were all the big bottled water companies, Nestle leading the pack. Peter Brabeck, the head of Nestle, said that it was a stupid idea. He now says, well, all right, let's put 1.5% of the world's water aside for the poor, and the rest will go to the market. So he's all heart, right, this guy? The big food companies were against it. The big water utilities, Suez and Veolia, were against it. The World Bank was against it because they're busy privatizing the world's water everywhere. My country led the fight against it. To my internal embarrassment, the US was against it, Great Britain was against it, Australia was against it. A group called the World Water Council, which is, I call them the Lords of Water. This is a group of companies and World Bank officials and so on who have this big forum every 3 years. They were against it. And we just passionately put together a global water justice movement and pushed and pushed and pushed. And I had the honor of serving as voluntary advisor to the 63rd president of the General Assembly, Miguel Descado Bachmann from Nicaragua. And he and I and the ambassador from Bolivia, a man named Pablo Solon, together put together a team and introduced the right to water to the General Assembly. And everybody freaked, oh, we're not ready, and we need another 20 years, and And Ambassador Solon said, you know what? And people tried to get him to remove sanitation and to kind of weaken the resolution. And he would say, I'd rather lose a good resolution than be the author of a bad resolution. So it was a very dramatic thing. We went to the General Assembly for a vote on July 28th, 2010, and I was in the balcony with some of my staff holding their hands because I thought we were going to lose, and I was just preparing them to lose and saying we'll be back in 5 years. And when they vote at the UN, they vote from their seat, so it just automatically goes right up on a board, and you see within seconds what the vote is. 122 countries in favor, no countries opposed. The countries, yours and mine, that didn't agree abstained. So that was a big victory, and the place kind of broke out in marvelous cheers. It was a magic moment. And I like to think of it as having taken an evolutionary step forward as the human species on that day. And since that day, we've had the rights defined very clearly by the Human Rights Council. The obligations on governments are there. If you're interested in looking at this more, we've got reports from different countries. On the Food and Water Watch website is a report on what a plan should be for the United States, because a lot of Native Americans don't have proper access to water. As I said, the people in inner city Detroit do not. There are a lot of poorer communities that don't have access to water. So it's not just far away that this right matters. And we've had a number of countries have now adopted laws for the right to water. But my favorite story is that the Kalahari Bushmen of Botswana, which is a country in Africa, lived in the Kalahari Desert for many years, the way their ancestors did. The president of Botswana has wanted them gone for years. He calls them an embarrassing anachronism because they still live the way they did, their ancestors did. And he was educated at Oxford, and he's embarrassed by them. And also they found diamonds in the Kalahari Desert, so they want them gone. So about 15 years ago, they started forcibly removing the Bushmen from the Kalahari, and it was pretty ugly. They put them in settlements. There was a lot of suicide, a lot of alcohol, a lot of drug taking. People came back to the desert because that's where they wanted to be, so they smashed their bore wells and their water wells. And they said, if you try to reopen them, we'll kill you. And there were people killed. And so they went to court, and they gained the right to go back to the desert, but not the right to water. The court did not uphold their right to water. After the resolution of July 2010, they went to the Supreme Court of Botswana and actually won not only the right to go back, but the right to water and the right to be compensated for the fact that they'd done without this water in those years. And I find it a very moving story, and love a photograph of the people, the community standing with the spears and the feathers and the loincloths and so on around this water hole that's been opened. I mean, it isn't a spa, but it is their water, and it gives them life, and it gives them life to go back to. And so we have stories like this coming at us from around the world as people start to interpret what this meant. So I'm just going to end with my favorite quotes, and then we can just talk. We have time for discussion. The first is from the late, great Carl Sagan. You will know his work, American scientist, environmentalist. And he said, anything else you are interested in is not going to happen if you cannot breathe the air and drink the water. Don't sit this one out. Do something. You are, by accident of fate, alive at an absolutely critical moment in our history. And I find that a kind of call to arms that is, I find particularly moving. And then the other one is from Tolkien. This is from Gandalf, watching the night when all evil things are going to destroy everything beautiful. And I kind of have Gandalf on the mind because not long ago, I took a bunch of people to northern Alberta to see the tar sands. If you don't know about them, this is what the Keystone fight is about. It's the dirtiest oil on earth. And it looks like a moonscape. So we took them on this tour, and then we went back to Edmonton and held a press conference, and I said that the tar sands were Canada's Mordor, and you'd know Mordor from the Lord of the Rings. One of the oil company executives should have said, "There's no comparison. What a stupid thing to say." Instead, he said, "It's not as bad as Mordor," which was yay for me, right? It's like, oh, what, half as bad as the death of nature? What, you know, if you're giving me that, then I won, right? So anyway, this is Scandal talking about being a steward, and that's what I hope you guys see yourselves at, a steward of our beautiful water and our beautiful land and nature. So he says, "The rule of no realm is mine, but all worthy things that are in peril, as the world now stands, those are my care. And for my part, I shall not wholly fail in my task, if anything passes through this night that can still grow fair, or bear fruit and flower again in the days to come. For I too am a steward. Did you not know?" Thank you. Sure, I can do it. I'm happy to. Whatever.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maude, for a really alarming and informative talk. And why don't we now open up the floor to questions? Who would like to?
Students first.
I wanted to just talk a little bit about fracking, the unconventional shale drilling, because that's a triple threat to our water supply. It takes 2 to 8 million gallons of water per frack. A well can be fracked 10 to 18 times. There was recently a well in Michigan that used like 40 million gallons of water for one frack. And that water, there's chemicals mixed, so that's contaminated forever. So there's the loss of the water, there's the threat of contamination from the chemicals under the ground from the fracking, and then there's where do you store the waste? Because the waste that comes back is radioactive in many cases because there's radium and radon at those depths that they're drilling for the shale. So that's the biggest threat. 34 states are engaging in this, and it's the reason why I'm here in New Hampshire. I just moved here in October because I came from Ohio to get away from the fracking. So I just want to know if that was something that you could address a little bit.
Happy to. I'm very, very concerned. We have a campaign against fracking in my country. We're working with people around the world. Food and Water Watch, this group I work so closely with here in the U.S., has also taken a very strong stand against fracking. So go to their website and they'll give you contacts. If you take a look, there's a satellite map now. You can Google it, that actually shows the lights from the fracking operations in Idaho and Wyoming and some of those states. Like you can see it from space. And that's, I don't know if you noticed when Obama last night said that he was really concerned about climate change, and in the next breath said he was going to cut the red tape for oil and gas exploration. He was talking fracking. It's exactly what he was talking, which tells me he may turn down the Keystone Pipeline because he may think that they're going to get enough energy from fracking to supply the U.S. No, it's a very serious issue. We need to be going for a full moratorium. That's our position. And we've fought very hard in my country. We've got a full moratorium just announced in Quebec, which is major. It's a huge province. Smile from my friend here. But now here's an interesting thing. I told you about these free trade agreements where a private corporation can sue. There's a NAFTA challenge against the ban in Quebec on fracking from an American fracking company, because they're saying, well, we were in Quebec and we were all ready to begin operations and you changed the rules and now you owe us money. So, and I expect we'll lose on that. I expect that the government will have to pay. So this is what I mean when I talk about these corporations having this kind of power. The fracking is we have got to stop thinking that we can continue with the level of energy production that we have or the kind of energy. And moving to fracking is not the answer. So I'm 100% with you, and thank you for raising it. That's why I said a little earlier, when we talk about it, to me, to my mind, I even made a list one day of the air versus water. as if air matters and water doesn't. And we're destroying systems now. I mean, there's a wonderful little article or report that just came out of Mexico City where this engineer, they found this new aquifer, and it's not going to last a long time because of the need, but there's a new water source under Mexico City, and they accessed it for the first time the other day, and the engineer who opened it up took a glass and drank it, and he said, Americans, this is what he said, the first words he said when he drank it, should be protecting their groundwater from fracking and other things. He didn't say fracking, but he said protecting their groundwater, because one day you're going to have to do what we're doing, and you're going to have to depend on this water because you're using up conventional sources. So just this notion that it's deep in the ground and it's far away is absolutely deeply incorrect. So thank you for raising it very much.
There is a microphone, right? Okay, so why don't you wait for the mic? There's another one over there, and then please introduce yourself.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yell it out.
I'm Justin Roshak. I'm a student here. This is a more philosophical question for you, ma'am. You mentioned the intrinsic value of nature. And beyond the collective and private needs of humankind, given that humans are the beings that create value and the concept of valuation only has meaning to our species, what do you mean by the intrinsic value of nature?
Well, it's a really tough and good question. I would argue that outside of its usefulness to us, nature has rights. And I would argue that to say that only we can give it value is to place a human-centered analysis of how value comes to be. I mean, I would say that other species have. I'm not saying don't go fishing. Okay, please don't misunderstand. I eat fish if it's proper, if it's not the kind that's dying or whatever. But what the rights of nature would say, you can fish, but you can't fish to extinction. You can't fish a species to extinction. That there is an intrinsic right of other species and of nature to the earth, to the bounty of the earth, and that it's not all just been put here for us. And I would argue that the notion that only by our giving it value does it come into being valuable would be a more Western construct. I think if you go to indigenous peoples anywhere in the world, including your country, my country, if they're still practicing their more traditional cultures and spiritual practices and so on, they value water. Like water gives them life. Water gives meaning. We get our meaning from that water rather than vice versa. And there's a lovely book by a Canadian colleague of mine who's a philosopher and a hydrologist, and he's kind of put the disciplines together. And he talks about what we've lost when we've lost that notion of what he calls waters. So with an S, he says we have one water. It's just this abstract, this resource, and he even says this notion of it being H2O, and he's a scientist. He said, of course it's H2O, and of course there's a hydrologic cycle, but learning it in that abstract way has allowed us to assign only really in a way economic value to it. And that we've lost touch with the other meanings of water. But I would argue that water, yes, it gives us life, and if we don't take care of it, we'll die. But I would argue that it has intrinsic value in and of itself, and I think that other species have rights to that water as well, and we have to start understanding that in a different way. Well, your question's a really good one, and you should do an essay on it. You should work on it, because it's this is new stuff, and it's kind of startling in some ways. What would it look like if the Gulf of Mexico could sue British Petroleum? I like to dream about what that might look like. At the moment, it was only people who could prove that they had direct financial negative impact. Damage was done to their business or their farm or whatever, but to the ecosystem, the Exxon Valdez, it's still wreaking havoc in the north, in the global north, in Alaska, in the waters of Alaska. All these years later, because this stuff just stays there, and there's no, how do you compensate nature? How do you compensate other species? I don't know the answers, but I think we have to start a dialogue around this. Because public trust basically says that water's there for all of us. But the notion that nature has rights actually goes a step further and says that nature has rights outside of its service to us. And so it's a step further to take.
I'm a law student specializing in water law. And it seems like the Western system, the prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, is unworkable in the time where we have these extreme droughts. And so and especially with having different doctrines for groundwater. And so I'm just wondering if there's other countries that you've encountered that have a better system, or do they have a similar system and are running into the same problems?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I would say even in your own country, you have better examples. And that's why I used the example of Vermont. It's one I'm particularly familiar with because I worked on them with the people who did it. And by the way, in Vermont, it was a woman state Republican senator and a woman state Democratic senator who co-introduced the bill together, which I think is really nice. So, and then it passed unanimously, this bill to protect groundwater. I look to the Vermont example as a really good example, and I know that it's fraught with problems in the West. I've read the books. I know some of the complicated, convoluted history of places like California. And I know that it's a dog's breakfast to try to figure it out. But I tell you what I believe with all my heart, that somebody's going to have to come along and have the courage to say it was law made for another reality. It was made for another time when we didn't understand what we understand now, and we've got to have a new law. And the new law has to say that water is a public trust, both the groundwater and the surface water, and we're going to have to figure out what that means together. And nobody, because with the notion of public trust, the idea is that no one owns it. You are collectively a steward of it. And so if, for instance, a private company wants to access that water, they have to go to the stewards, that's us, and say, you know, maybe it's a water board or whatever, and they say we want X amount of water, and we decide whether we'll let them have access to it. And I personally think they should be paying for raw water. I have no problem with that. We always talk about pricing water for residents. Well, I mean, we use a very small portion comparatively. It's big agribusiness, it's big hydro, it's big mining. That's where the water's going. So I would argue that we need to have also a discussion about who should be paying for it. But I think somebody brave is going to have to come along before it is the crisis before it becomes manifested as the crisis that I see coming. And say what we had in the past isn't working anymore. I'll give you an example. Australia, I told you about the Murray-Darling, and there's all this siphoning off massive amounts of water, sending it out in the form of virtual water exports, wine, and I love Australian wine, but it's really hurting the Murray-Darling. There's a lovely bunch of people who are saving some turtles, because when the Murray-Darling stopped running to the mouth of the ocean, it was killing the turtles. So they had this whole school project called Hurry, Hurry, Save the Murray, and it was so involving kids and stuff. Anyway, it's very moving what they're trying to do there. But what the government did in 1994 was because they've got these big conglomerates, like there's one called Cubby Cotton, and then they own just massive amounts of water licenses, or they had massive amounts of water licenses. The government converted them in one piece of legislation to water rights. And that meant that they now basically own the water. It was like the giveaway of land back in the 1800s or whatever here in North America. So they gave them the water. And the idea was, well, because it's now valuable to you, you'll take better care of it, and then you'll make money on it, and you'll trade. What happened was the big conglomerates started buying up the small farmers. Then the investors came in, then the foreign investors came in, and the price of water jumped through the roof. And when a new government 10 years later said, my God, we're desperate for water back for the Murray-Darling, for the ecosystem to save it, they tried to buy the water back, and they couldn't afford it. That's what I see happening in the West. I see with the T. Boone Pickens, he's maybe the extreme, but I see this water hoarding and this water trading, and they're beginning to talk about water, open market water trading now. It's not just between farmers. It used to be kind of local, now it's going longer distances. T. Boone Pickens just sold a bunch of water to a private development company. So, we're beginning to see that real, like a commodities market, and I think it's got to be stopped. And I think we have to have that kind of debate on it. Now, New Hampshire, you still have lots of water here, so you're not going to have the sense of urgency, but any of you who've visited or have family in New Mexico or, the California, the states that are in water crisis will know that this is a very hot topic of conversation. And I used to get all involved in the complications, but now, last time I was in Australia and I stopped saying, well, it's complicated. It's not complicated. Pass a law, undo what you did. It was a mistake. Get that water back. If you have to pay for it, get it back. That water belongs to the people of Australia. That water belongs to the ecosystem. That water belongs to future generations. And what we are doing now, and mark my words when I say this, we are using up water that belongs to the future. If the Ogallala Aquifer goes dry, and I read to you from this guy, Bauer, who runs the Ogallala Center for the the U.S. Department of Agriculture, if it goes dry, that's the water system for the next generations. Do we have the right to do that? Do we think some technology is going to come along and save us? I don't. Desalination is expensive, it's dirty, puts a dirty, polluted brine back in the ocean. It creates climate problems because it creates greenhouse gas emissions. That's not the answer. There isn't a technological answer that we know right now. I mean, everybody's still hoping for cold fusion sort of thing, but for the climate crisis, we don't have an easy answer for water and conservation and taking care of the water we have, source protection, watershed restoration, rainwater harvesting. These are the answers. The old answers that people knew centuries ago are the answers today. And so when you look at the complications in your work, I would urge you to be part of a kind of thinking that says, I recognize all the complications, but can we break through it? Can we break through it to a new model? Could we take a model like Vermont and apply it? And what kind of political courage would it take? Probably you'd never get elected, but anyway, it still has to be said and debated. Down here.
Over here.
So when you talk about enclosures, I guess we all know that you're getting into the whole debate between tragedy of the commons and how we solve that. And so you basically give a lot of examples where privatization doesn't solve the tragedy of the commons, so that's like the traditional solution. Do you have any examples where we see successful communal management of the commons on a large scale?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. You all have studied the tragedy of the commons. What it should really be called is the tragedy of the ungoverned commons, because that's not what I'm talking about here. When you have an open, ungoverned commons, well then, yes, you get, I would argue that that's what we have had now, but it's also, the private sector has plundered the commons. Everybody's plundered the commons, if you want to put it that way. What I'm talking about is a properly managed commons. So that might be, think about national parks as an example. A well-run national park or a state park is a commons, but you're not allowed to go in and do anything you want. They just banned bottled water from Yosemite because not for any ideological reasons, but the wardens there were saying people are just dumping their bottled water. There's a psychology to bottled water, and I don't know what it is. Like people will carry the rest of their garbage out, but they were dumping their bottled water. And so they said it's the #1 garbage problem that we have in Yosemite, and we want it gone. So the tragedy of the commons, to my mind, is we don't have that kind of commons, or certainly I don't have that kind of commons in mind. What we're talking about is that we have a body of water. Let's take the Great Lakes. Well, we are arguing, and I've written a paper on this, a report on this, and we've actually got a tour going on promoting this, is that we got to start seeing the Great Lakes as one watershed, which it is. It's actually one big lake. And there are 2 countries, 2 provinces, 8 states, multiple municipal jurisdictions. It's a mess. And the laws aren't good enough, and they're not obeyed, and this and that and the other thing. We need to start thinking basin-wide. What would it look like if we saw it as a commons? And that would mean that it belongs to the people who live on and around it. And everybody would have what I call the right to care. You know, I might not be a scientist, I might not be an environmentalist, I might not be anything that's, you know, anybody considers important, I might not be an elected official, but I live on, you know, Lake Erie or Lake Ontario or whatever, and I care, and I have the right to care. And that's the concept here, is that this is our commons. And Canada, there's a nuclear facility called Bruce Power, and they actually want to ship 16 nuclear-sized spent nuclear rods, bus-sized nuclear rods, through the Great Lakes on a ship to go to Sweden to be recycled or something. And everybody along the way is now saying, "Are you crazy? What if there's an accident?" I mean, so if you think of it as your water, if you look at it and say, "That belongs to me. I'm one of the owners of this lake," right? Or I'm a steward of this lake, then you're going to say no to that kind of behavior. So it's really getting people thinking in that way. You asked for an example. The example I would give you is Europe. Pre the austerity, they're going through changes now, but pre-austerity in 2000, Europe adopted a new watershed management process, a watershed agreement, because most of their lakes, rivers, and aquifers not only cross one political boundary, but often many. And so they are now governing the water management and water protection on watersheds by the watershed, as a watershed, as opposed to, you know, we're responsible up to this line and then that's your country and you're responsible there. People understood that didn't work. And it's quite a wonderful story. There's a lake called Lake Constance, that was totally, completely polluted, dead, awful. And when I was there a couple of years ago, they dipped a cup in it and said, "Here, you can drink it." So I did. A little nervous, but I did. And lo and behold, I'm still here. So they've cleaned it up by joint management of what they call this commons. So it's not a commons that anybody can do what they want, take what they want, dump what they want. It's exactly the opposite. A well-managed commons is the way to protect it from both careless exploitation and then deliberate exploitation. Which is not to say governments have been wonderful, don't get me wrong. I mean, anywhere from our governments to the former Soviet Union to China, governments around the world have not done the job they need to do in the environment. But turning it over to private interests is not the issue, is not the answer. We have the right to good governance, I argue, and we need to keep fighting for it.
Do you have any questions, sir?
Yeah, following up on that, taking water as public trust, what policies would be required within the basin for appropriate allocation of this resource or public trust?
Well, that would have to be determined, I would argue, as that's part of the democratic process that you would go through. That if you agree that it's a public trust and you agree that you're going to set criteria, then you I would say hold public hearings. I think people should be part of the decision making as to you know, who gets access to that water and under what circumstances, and who should be paying for it and who shouldn't. So that's a dialogue. What they did in Vermont, they did have public hearings, and they did have a public dialogue. It was led by the Vermont Natural Resources Council. And they determined that they actually said that water is for people's daily needs, like priority for people's daily needs, for ecosystem protection, and for local food production. They're giving priority to water use for that. And if you think of it that way, then the commercial users come along and say, well, we want X amount, and you can say, well, okay, but don't pollute, because we're watching you. It's not your water, it's our water. So I would argue that that's a process that each community would have to go through. And you'd have to go through it with the question in mind of how much water you have. I mean, there are places that still have more water than other places, or certainly per capita, and you'd have more of a license to be able to expand water access. But if you know that you're running out of water, if you can say, like, every country in the Middle East is due to run out of water within 30 to 50 years. I mean, and some right now are Yemen, the capital of Yemen, ran out of water last month. So it depends on where you are and how severe this is going to have to be. I mean, Israel stopped exporting a lot of foods that it used to export that just can't use their water for export anymore. So it really, the water will win in the end. Like it'll tell us, if we don't do this properly and voluntarily, it'll happen to us. I remember being in Australia and these rice farmers, because 4 years ago now in Australia, they had such a drought that there was consecutive droughts, but the rice export dropped 98% in one summer. Like the rice industry died, right? And I remember this one family, this rice growing family, they had a big farm, the woman just weeping in my arms. And she said, this was bad planning by the government, because if they had told us 10 years ago or even longer ago, we don't have enough water for you to continue to use all this water for rice exports. If you use half, then we're all going to be okay. And if they had helped us with that, she said, then we would still be here. Maybe we'd make less money, but we'd still be here, but we're going to lose our farm. And what I didn't say to her was, and your rice farm lobby was so tough against any decrease in water allocations. I mean, that's the other thing. You get the big lobbies, and they didn't want anybody to touch their water rights. And so it was like, it's what our wonderful environmentalist from Canada, David Suzuki, calls exponential overuse of a water source, and that is you can't see it coming, and you can't count it. It's not 1 and 1 makes 2, 2 and 2 makes 4, 4 and 4 makes 8. It's 2 times 2, 4 times 2, or 4, 16 times 16, and it's exponential. And what may look okay one day is not okay the next. And he uses this example of a pond, and he says that a pond can have lily pads as long as it's not covered, because then it gets smothered. And so he says, okay, here's a pond, and on day 60, it's going to be covered with lily pads, and it's going to die, right? With exponential growth or exponential pollution, what does it look like on day 59? It's only half covered in lily pads. So it looks okay. Day 59, it looks okay. Day 60, it's gone. And that's what I worry about, is this exponential overpumping that we're not understanding, that we can't see it coming because of that. So the planning has to be done with scientists. We have scientists in this room. We need your help on the water mapping, on the water, on the supplies that we have, on the quality of water, on what's hurting the water. We need planners. We need people who can work with. We need community people who can help sort out who has access and so on. It's a complicated process, and it's going to get more complicated because I tell you, the demand is going straight up in our world and the supply is going straight down. So we're either going to fight about it, like really fight about it, or we're going to come to some kind of terms about it.
So a lot of the discussion was framed sort of in terms of big business interest about water. And I agree that business interests should not be the primary consideration with water, but I guess it matters in terms of moving forward feasibility because of what you mentioned for lobbies. So is there some sort of water policy that big business will stomach?
It depends which big business. I think there are a lot of businesses that are really concerned about water, especially if they depend on water, like agribusiness and so on, that want to do better and want to help work with us. Absolutely. The ones who want to run the water systems for profit, I don't think we're ever going to agree with them, But I think there's a very important role for business in building infrastructure, in laying the pipes. I mean, I have no problem with that. I'm not saying that should be government. I have no problem with that being the role of business. And I think that business, often small business, has a huge role to play in helping come up with new solutions, often low-tech, more appropriate low-tech solutions. There are lots of things happening out there that are really exciting. In fact, when I have a second life and get some time, I've got a website, or no, just my own website, not a website, a file, electronic file, where I collect These incredible things that people send me from all over the world, these fabulous ideas or inventions that people have come up with, and people are really excited, but they can't get a buyer because the World Bank goes to the big dams and the big recycling and the big desalination. Peter Glick, who runs the Pacific Institute, says the World Bank knows how to spend $1 billion in one place, but it doesn't know how to spend $1 million in 1,000 places, or better still, $1,000 in 1,000,000 places, and that's often the technology that's needed. So there's the people doing this wonderful, innovative technology, and they can't get to the places that need it. And somebody needs to open a portal and do this and do work with the World Bank and others and the UN to find those bright ideas and put them in touch with the places that need them, because often those big solutions are not the solution to a rural community or a community in the global south sort of thing. So yes, there's a huge role for business. And I speak often to business students and business schools and so on, because I challenge them to help make this part of the, become part of the solution. But I don't think that the private sector should be determining allocation of water. I don't think that the private sector should be determining who gets the diminishing water resources in our world, because if you're in business, especially a big business, you've got to compete and you've got to earn money, and that's the way it is. And that's not, I'm not accusing anybody of anything. It's not moral or immoral, it's amoral. We need to keep decisions around these life and death resources within public hands. There's a role for the private sector, but keeping control of the under the public, I think, is really crucial here. Or you're going to see millions and millions and millions more people die because I'm watching governments that are giving away so much power to the private sectors in their country that there's no way they're going to be able to say, well, this limited water has to be used for the human right to water. I'm seeing people being displaced all over the place and water confiscated. I mean, it's happening now. It's not like some future kind of scenario. So those are the principles that I would argue, and I think you can sell that to thoughtful business people who care about corporate social responsibility. Maybe one last. I know that I was two? Perfect.
Yeah, why don't we take the two together?
Perfect.
Okay.
All right.
They're next to each other. It was very nice.
I'll take.
My name's Glenn. You have this noble cause. You're taking a very optimistic and very humane approach to dealing with this huge issue. Maybe we'll live to see the day when the U.S. Supreme Court will declare water to be a person. Maybe we'll see that. But isn't ultimately, at the risk of making this into kind of a grim science, the ultimate problem is something that you mentioned basically just once, and that is population. And what are we going to do about it? And what do the scientists and demographers say out there? Can we, if we become extremely efficient, if we become extremely just, can we all still survive with the water supplies that we have?
Okay. Why don't I take the other question and then, yeah, perfect.
Kind of a showstopper by itself.
Hi. Anyway, I'm Scott. We go to St. J.A., but I'm from Fairleigh. And in Fairleigh, I know for a fact that we have Lake Maury, and we also have that nice little river that flows between the bridge. We're only 600 people. We're really small, and I kind of scared of the fact that, other places don't have that kind of resource. If you go to Lake Maury, it's nice and clean, but it's you don't want to drink it right now. It's lake water, but I just want to know, when you hear about entire continents having trouble, but this small little state that's doing okay, how does the, as Mr. Irain kind of said, you have different populations in areas. I'm pretty sure Vermont will always be small. How do you think it'd be an efficient way of distributing that sort of water? Because, we're not selfish people. We like our neighbors. We'd be perfectly fine in giving some of it, as long as, we can meet the needs of the people there. But it seems really hard to do that if you're running out of gas and you're also running out of ways to give it to people that need it.
Well, these are really wonderful questions to end with, and I thank you very much for them, Scott and Glenn. Well, you say Vermont may not end up having a lot of people, but Burlington's growing really quickly, I notice. Who knows, as places run out of water, I think you're going to find more people moving to water. It might not be the water moving to people, it may be more people moving to water. So that's just an image to have in mind. Really, I think that removing water from watersheds is not the answer. Moving it long distances, to an extent, maybe growing food in some areas that have more water and shipping the food is probably the better way to do it. But then, as I said earlier, while that might make sense at a sort of ideological level, the reality is that it's often poor parts of the world that are doing that, and they can't afford that water loss at all. So it's again, it becomes who's willing to give up their water, like Naivasha in Kenya that I described, but that's happening all over Africa, where water sources are being used to grow food for other countries. So that becomes complicated as well. The question, I mean, the best thing you can do is take care of your water. Just take care of it. Like, you've got it, it hasn't been destroyed yet, take care of it. It's the most important thing you can do with that water that you have. The question about the population issue is really important. We are a planet that's going to probably peak at between 9 and 10 billion, and they now say then it will go down, that it's already going down in many parts of the world, and that when it peaks there, it will go down. And Fred Pierce, a British writer and environmentalist, says that he says it'll be followed by not enough people, whether you can believe that or not, but he just wrote a book on decrying the whole population bomb theory. He says that it's all workable and it's going to come back down. The question is not, in my mind, so much population as population combined with lifestyle and combined with consumption and combined with our modern notion of more stuff, more growth, more. I was in a conference once in Kerala, India, in the south of India. We held an outdoor conference. It was a big conference / protest against a Coca-Cola factory that was right across the street, and it was again these big fortresses with armed guards and dogs and big iron gates and so on. So we held the conference outside so that we could use loudspeakers so that they would hear. So all the speeches, all the politicians came in and everybody ranted against it. And they ended up closing that Coca-Cola factory because they were just draining the local water source. And literally people's water sources were drying up. But what I always remember is that they would feed, there were 600 or 700 of us, okay? And they would feed us. We would go through these lineups and these beautiful women in the beautiful saris. I just always remember, I just have this image. They would have little clay cups for this lovely tea that we'd have, and then you'd give the clay cup back and it was to be washed. And everything else was given to us on a great big leaf, a coconut leaf or a banana leaf. Most beautiful food. And then you'd use the bread or, the chapati or whatever to eat the food. And then when they were finished, they threw the leaves in the forest. And there wasn't, with 600 or 700 people, they produced less pollution than I do if I order in for my family, right? And I'm so conscious of that. If I order in food and they bring all this, I shouldn't have ordered in, and I feel so terrible, and it creates all this garbage. 600 people with less garbage. So it's just a memory that I have, that it's not so much population per se, but it's the way we're living. And the lack of, again, these are people who just, everything for them is protecting their water. Like, their water is absolutely sacred, and they would never do to their water. The women, they were so upset about what the Coca-Cola plant was doing that they held a silent vigil in front of the Coca-Cola plant every morning for 3 years. And women from little babies to the age of 90 would sit cross-legged quietly. It was silent, totally peaceful. They didn't mock anybody who went in to work there, and lots of their community did because they needed the jobs. It was just gentle, constant. They got the world's attention. People were so moved by it. And then they had some scientists come in. They did some study. They said it's destroying the local water table. Went to the court in India. The court shut them down. It was a total victory. So it's just a memory that I have, and I think of, me ordering food in for compared to this. And so yes, I think it's the way we live, and it's the choices we make. And this is, for all of us to figure out collectively how to step forward. But just to say to you that I'm enormously positive. We won, and I got to go now, but we won a big fight in rural Ontario near Georgian Bay on a water a dump site that was going to be built on a beautiful aquifer, and we fought and fought and fought, and we won. One of the ways we won is a group of Aboriginal women who live in a community there set up a peace camp, and they would have prayers just happen to be in front of the heavy equipment every morning. So they'd stop the equipment every single morning until it was too late and there was going to be a frost, and so we gained a year, and that was the year we needed to get some evidence, and we got the thing stopped. And there were a lot of arrests. They arrested a lot of these women. They arrested this 82-year-old woman, farm woman, who'd never even had a parking ticket, and she was baking sugar tarts for the local church when the police came to get her, right? So of course we said, oh, bring the police in and give them butter tarts and we'll call the media. So she said, oh, now boys, she said, before we go, let's have some butter tarts and tea. So the guys came in, they sat down. Meanwhile, we get the media, we get all those cameras and stuff. So when she's led away to be arrested, we have all the media there, and she said, I've never been arrested in my life. And she said, but if I'm going down for water. And it was just a sweet, sweet victory. And the day that we had the big vote, is county council, so it was the mayors of a bunch of small communities, little villages, because it's a whole rural community, they got together. There was the big vote, and the whole national media was there, and there were hundreds of people there. Like, it was a big fight, gone on for years. And the guy who's the mayor of a little village called Tiny Township, great big mayor of Tiny Township, was a big tough guy, and he was going to fight. It was called Site 41. He was going to fight for Site 41. He was going to vote against this moratorium, and he thought this was the dumbest thing, and he loved fighting these protesters. He got up to say what he was going to say, and we knew he would sway a bunch of people, and we were really nervous about him because he was our enemy number one, right? Gets up and starts to cry. He said, when I got up this morning, I went into my home office, and I was getting ready to come and do battle here and fight for Site 41 against all you protesters. And he says this to the people in the gallery. He said, my grandchildren had found one of the Stop Site 41 signs. They're all over the neighborhood. And they put it on my desk, and they wrote the word Papa on it, meaning you, Papa, you stop Site 41. And he said, in that moment, my job description changed, and I became a steward of the water. And he said, as long as I live, I will never, ever allow Site 41 to be opened. So it was like a huge moment. The whole place erupted in cheers, right? And people were crying, and he changed the votes of a whole bunch of other people, and we won it. And I've just always remembered that as a kind of a turning point when we say, what am I here for? And so I leave you with that thought of being a steward for our water, because we need it. Thank you very much.